Okay, a little housekeeping to start. Everybody turn off their phones, please. I think that's required, right? Yes. So, my name's Steve Shapiro, and when I moved here from New England in 1975, my first job was I had been like Ken, a migrant college history teacher. And my first job was with the California Historical Society, and the director came up to me one day and said, there's this guy that's got this really interesting project going about Jewish socialist chicken farmers up in Petaluma. And I want to introduce you to him. So he did, and that was almost 50 years ago, and I've had the honor of being Ken's friend ever since. I had COVID in December, and Ken brought me really a yucky case of it. And Ken brought me an earlier version of this book that he's going to, and I was just blown away. And it's not because of the COVID. It was, it just moved me so much as a testament to things that matter: family, love, a terrible disease, a reconciliation with a father who he had some differences. Is that, yeah, differences with.
Put it that way.
Yeah, I can put it that way. And I'm not going to talk about the book except to say that it deeply moved me, and I was honored to read it, and like I've been honored to be Ken's friend for 50 years. So it's my pleasure to introduce Kann.
Yay.
Yay. Now let's pivot that mic back a little bit. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No, that's good. Wow. Very sensitive. So, hello. Welcome. Thanks. A couple of thanks first. Thanks to Stephen for that nice introduction and for introducing me to Bird and Beckett, to Eric, and to helping make arrangements to make this evening possible. I very much appreciate it. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Bird and Beckett, for being here and for opening this wonderful bookstore to people who love books. It makes a huge difference to have independent bookstores, neighborhood bookstores, good bookstores, something interesting to look at wherever you look in this store. It's a fabulous place. Thank you for having me. And thank you all for coming out. It makes a big difference. When you're an author, you're spending a lot of time alone talking to yourself about what you're writing or thinking to yourself. And it's not often that you get to speak with live people about your ideas. So this is one of those evenings for me. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And what I'd like to do is I want to talk a bit about this book, and then I want to read some passages from it, passages that I like, which I'll explain why I've chosen them. And then we can open things up for questions or answers or comment or whatever. And then I'll stay around and talk to whoever wants to talk and sign my name to whoever wants my signature and all of that. So, we won't keep you too late either, I hope. So first of all, the book. It tells two stories. It tells the story, first of all, of my father's death from the dread disease ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, words that I never thought that I'd learn, so big, so complicated. And I did learn them. It became second nature to me when my father was diagnosed with ALS. And it's a doctor friend described it to me as a dread disease. And I came to understand that. And anybody who's dealing with ALS or with a loved one who has ALS comes to understand that. It's a disease that primarily is notorious for paralyzing its victims. That is, you lose the strength of your muscles, not all of them, but most. And so my father, over a period of diagnosis in October of 1979 to when he died in December of 1980, that's about 14 months. It's very quick. And during that time, he became completely paralyzed. That is, he became a quadriplegic. He couldn't do anything with his legs. I don't know about his toes. I was thinking about that today for some reason. But his arms, his hands, his fingers, all of it, and lots of other parts of his body, too. And that was an amazing and terrible thing to witness. He had been a high school athlete. He was a proud man. He was a very self-reliant person, for better and for worse, and was transformed into somebody who was relying on other people all the time for everything, even to scratch an itch. And that was a terrible thing for him. So that's one story that the book tells, and that's a story in its own right. I think. And then the other story is of my father and me, because we had been estranged for a long time when he was diagnosed. Again, this was 1978 in October, and I was living in California then. I was in my mid-30s, and I had just gotten my PhD degree at Berkeley in history, and I was not going in the right direction to become a professor. Quite the opposite. I decided not to become a professor. I was going to become a writer, freelance historian. Not a great idea as I look back. You spend many years to get a PhD degree. It's a meal ticket, pretty steady one at that time. And for some reason, I threw it in the trash and started my own make up your career as a freelance historian. That was a puzzle to my father, to put it mildly. And one of many disappointments I felt that I had been for him. This kind of grew out of the 60s, this strange choice, but it made sense to me at the time. And, of course, the community that I was studying, this community of Jewish socialist chicken ranchers, was fascinating. And I just knew I could do a good book with that place. And I did eventually, but it took me many, many years. And life intervened in a lot of ways, and it was not smooth at all. So it tells the book tells a second story, and that's of my father and me, and our relationship, and this chasm that we had lived with, and how we dealt with that when he was diagnosed with ALS and started suffering from the limitations of ALS. He was a very independent man, and to be dependent on other people, as I said before, was not in his game book at all. The book, I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but it makes sense when I explain. It took me 45 years to do it. And with the Petaluma book, it had taken me 19 years, and I thought that was awfully long for a book. I had gone up to Petaluma in 1974 to begin taping the old-timers. There were still people from the immigrant generation who were there, and I got there just in time to tape them, and the book was published 19 years later in 1993. A lot of things happened in the middle. And so I thought, okay, that was pretty long, but that book's done and good. But this one is really 45 years from start to finish. And start was when my father was diagnosed. And in October of 1979, my youngest brother, Bob, called me to tell me the diagnosis. And I can't remember if I have notes of that conversation, but I called a doctor friend right after that to ask about ALS. And I do have my notes of that conversation, which tells me I decided to take notes and keep notes. And I kept them. And I kept every piece of paper after that about ALS, and I started a journal. And the journal didn't keep record, chapter and verse of everything that happened, but it was enough for me over the years to go back to that journal and read it and remember what happened. And even even as I was going into the final stages of this book and wanted to refresh my memory about things, I'd go back to that journal and I would just have a line or two. But it seemed to and my memory's not that great, but it seemed to trigger my recollection. So I started very early with a book, and that was, I think of 1979 when my father was diagnosed, is when this began, when I started keeping a record of what was happening. And the year after my father died, 1981, I started writing. And over a couple of years, I wrote a couple of chapters, which I knew were not right. I didn't know what was wrong, but I knew they were not right. And so that slowed me down. And I showed it to a couple of book people, and it was not getting much enthusiasm. And a second thing that stopped me from working on the book was I went to law school. And this came out of this book, too, because I decided I had as you'll see when I read you some passages, I had to be able to support myself, and I couldn't do it as a freelance historian. I thought I could do it as a lawyer. The question was whether I could write while I was a lawyer. And, of course, the answer I found was mostly not. I started the book. I had a couple of chapters. I stopped. I went to law school. I became a lawyer. It took a couple of years to learn how to practice law. And then I went back to writing on the weekends and at night. But it was that book about the chicken ranchers. That was my first unfinished business from switching careers. And amazingly, in the mid-1990s, I had a manuscript that was good, and I found a publisher and published it. And the outcome of that book was a tremendous amount of excitement and enthusiasm about publishing a book. If you've never done it, there's nothing quite like it. It's very gratifying, big fun. Basically, you've got some paper out there that says what you said, and people read it. Some people do, and they're interested, and you talk to them about it. And that's as good as it gets. I mean, that's really good. Don't expect to make much money, at least I didn't. And by then I was a lawyer, so I didn't need the money. I had another way to earn. This was my plan, and it happened. And but it was very time intensive. So I went back and I wrote and published that book on the chicken ranchers, and I thought I could go back to writing this book about my father, too, because I had a huge amount of momentum in the mid-1990s. And I had a revelation, too. And my revelation was the problem with those chapters, those first chapters I wrote, were that they were not enough. That is, I had to write not only the story of what happened to my father with ALS, but I had to write about him and me. That's what would make it a compelling story. I mean, the ALS story is a harrowing story for sure, and very gripping in my view. But the story of him and me, along with the ALS story, I thought that was what this book had to be about. And so the revelation was the book was not only about him, but it was about him and me, and a painful subject. But that's where the action was. And so I reconceived the book and started working on it again and wrote a couple more chapters, and maybe I got to where I'm going to read tonight, about halfway. And then just law practice, very demanding and very hard to write while you're practicing law, at least in my case. It was very hard for me. So I stopped again, and then over the years I would start and I would stop and write a couple more chapters here and there. And finally, when the pandemic came, 2020, I had time. I was retired by then. I had been working on a different writing project for a couple of years. I didn't know what I was going to do being sent home. I finally realized I have this manuscript. You know, it went everywhere I went, and I had it, and it was still on my mind. I was still thinking about it, and I really applied myself to it. And this was the first time I applied myself to it where I had nothing but time to work on it. And extraordinarily, I finished it. And that's what stands before you today, 45 years. Not continuous work, but 45 years it's been on my mind, and I've been thinking about it and working on it on and off, and I'm pretty proud of it too. The story, my father, during one of our conversations about life after he would die, because he knew he was dying at some point, he told me that he was sorry that he would be remembered only with ALS, and that bothered him. He was very emaciated, very weakened, and just, I think, to put it concisely, he didn't feel like himself. This wasn't him. This was somebody else. His body wasn't him. It was him inside his body, but his body was not his. It wasn't who he was. And he felt that people wouldn't see him, wouldn't remember him for who he was. So, of course, that meant with my book, I was going to have to really place his life in context. That is, write it historically. And he had a rich history. Not that he was an extraordinary person, but he came out of the west side of Chicago, out of the Jewish immigrant west side of Chicago, which I happen to know something about. I knew a lot about Jewish immigration, and I knew a lot about Chicago history. And so I realized that the book I was going to write was going to have to provide the history, the background. And of course, when you're writing history, it's got to be interesting too. You can't just have a bunch of facts marching down the page. It doesn't work that way. You got to make it interesting. And so, but the history had to be there. And since I was writing his history, I had to write my own history because I was going to be in the story too. And I had to lay his history out against mine. And you'll see in just what I'm reading here a little bit about how I did it. But you got to read the book to see more. That was a challenge, though, because you want to write a tight book. You want it to have some oomph, some impact when people write it, but you want to get that full story in so that people understood he wasn't just a man with ALS, but he had a life that ALS came into. That was important. The last thing is it's a memoir. The last point I want to raise, and that is that it's a memoir, which was a great revelation for me in the 1990s. This would be a book about me as well as about my father. But what I had forgotten about was if you're writing a memoir, you got to write about yourself. And that's not so easy. If you're a private person like me, writing about yourself does not come easily. And so that's another thing in its own right, and that I've taken on with this book. I think I seem to come to memoir more easily than I would have expected. And so you'll have to read it yourself and decide whether I've been successful. But I think I've done a pretty good job of writing about myself. You have to draw lines. You're not going to write everything because it'll be boring and also embarrassing probably. So you can't write everything, but it's like any other writing project. You've got to craft it, and it's got to be crafted to the purposes that you've got in mind, what the book's about. And so I've tried to do that with this book, and I'll find out from people, I hope, whether I've been successful. I like it. So I want to read some passages, and I want to read from chapter 6. There are 9 chapters and an epilogue, and this is chapter 6. It's sort of in the middle. It's called Retirement, and it's what happened on July 17th, 1980. That was the day my father retired from work. And it was a big day for him and for me, too. He had waited for me to... the book is structured around a series of visits I made to my parents during this 14, 15 months of his death. And this was the big visit in the middle of the whole thing, where I faced a lot of problems, medical and financial, and also the transformation of his life with retirement, which was a very big thing. So I'm not gonna read the whole chapter, although I'd like to, but I'm gonna read some passages from it to give you a feeling of it. So again, he was diagnosed October of 1979. This is July 1980. This is 8 months after he he was diagnosed. But how will we get down those steps? I asked Mom. 5 front steps. He knows how to do it. Dad had agreed to use the wheelchair he had banished to the basement for this trip, but we had not yet built a ramp. There was no avoiding those steps. We were always behind ALS. It was just very hard to keep up with it, and that ramp to help him get out of the house when he couldn't walk anymore. He was in a wheelchair by this time. That ramp, we did get it eventually, and we had it in the works at this point, but not for that day. So my mother's saying he knows how to do it. Dad agreed to use the wheelchair he had banished to the basement. He hated having any disability tools, apparatuses, wheelchairs out in sight. But we had not yet built a ramp. There was no avoiding those steps. We used his ingenious walker to shuffle our way to the front porch. There he encountered the steps like a rock climber descending a cliff face. He plotted each perilous step, then maneuvered at a glacial pace, deliberating after each slight movement downward. He grabbed familiar handholds he had devised on the iron railing these past months and located familiar foot placements as he negotiated the precipitous 8-inch drops between steps. Here was my dad, the high school athlete. He sweated under the intense morning sun as he struggled to shift weight and maintain balance with his weakened limbs. I got a whiff of his body odor. Sweet, not unpleasant. I strained to help. I supported him under the shoulders. I moved with his lead, following his rocking rhythm as he toiled downward. I struggled to prevent a disastrous fall and to avoid causing one. There had been no falls on these steps before, and we wouldn't have one now. As we descended, I puzzled over how he had done this for months without me, down those stairs daily to go to work, and back up too, until he stopped going to work just a few weeks ago. Mom had helped him many times, but she refused to watch. It was easier to help than to watch. Dad and I labored down, oblivious to the world, but the world noticed us. Our slow-motion ballet down the steps was so tortured that a passing motorist stopped his car. He ran over and helped us. That morning, my father would retire. I was taking Dad to his workplace. He wanted to say goodbye. And then I go on to talk a little bit about his, on our drive to the place, to his workplace. I talked about his history, some of his history in becoming a chemist, which was his profession. And then having done his, I talked a little bit about my own and what my work history was and compared them. And then I'm picking up here now at the end of me talking about my own work history, writing my history, as it were. My new trajectory was clear. At 21, I set my sights on graduate school in history at UC Berkeley. I hadn't thought about accounting for years. I came to the University of Wisconsin thinking I'd be a combination CPA and tax attorney. I hadn't thought about accounting for years. I didn't consider law school. I didn't apply anywhere else. And I was right. Looking back now, higher education was enjoying a growth explosion with idealistic baby boom students like me. University campuses were driving national and international social change. Berkeley was a leader with both the university and the student movement. I never asked Dad what he made of it all. My steady, reliable father, son of immigrants, child of the Depression, problem-solving chemist, family man, creator of post-war suburban affluence, and purchaser of a new Chevrolet every 2 years, had provided me with every advantage. I had the intelligence, work ethic, and family support to succeed in any career path I might choose. I declined the choice of my Skokie friends, the suburb where I grew up, my Skokie friends who pursued business and familiar professions. Instead, I selected student, rebel, and scholar. With scant information, I opted for years of graduate study and living on a pittance along an unknown path to a mysterious career as a university professor. And on the other side of the country, in unknown, unpredictable California. I knew it was right, but how could Dad get it? And what did he think of my next transformation? To freelance popular historian 11 years after I had enrolled in graduate school. That was the detour from the university professor career in 1977, just when I had completed my PhD degree, my hard-earned passport to an academic job, a salary, and the end of an already extended adolescence. I emerged in the 1970s with my PhD and new career, freelance popular historian. It was no job Dad could recognize, no workplace, no boss, no dress code, no paycheck, and almost no income. I scrambled for writing grants and temporary college teaching gigs. Others might have said my career path was downward mobility, from becoming an upper middle class professional to a wandering part-time teacher and wannabe writer, that is, an academic migrant worker. At the time of the ALS diagnosis, when I was 35, I didn't have to ask my father what he thought of my work. I knew, quote, all those years in school, what kind of job is this? And then on to his actual retirement at the workplace. Dad ended his work life over 3 hours that July morning that began with the descent of our front steps. I wheeled him through the TRW cinch offices as he X'd the retirement papers, all his atrophied fingers could do. We went on to the laboratories and production areas for more goodbyes. An emaciated figure in a wheelchair, pushed through by his son, everyone could see he was a dying man. Dad wanted a simple departure with no ceremony, but he insisted on this final visit. I had arranged it with the personnel office. They'd been relieved to hear from me. They'd been wondering how long he could continue working. I had told a few people were coming, but news of his presence spread. As I wheeled him through the building, colleagues spilled out of offices and laboratories to say goodbye. I watched the reactions. Some of the clerical workers handling the retirement papers were officious, barely looking up as they processed his papers. Several executives were cautious, as if a strong word or fast movement might cause him to expire. A couple of engineers seemed thrown, at a loss for what to say. Others simply denied what was happening, speaking as if he would return in a few weeks after a brief vacation. A few people had avoided my father during the months of decline, and they remained behind closed doors, shunning him again this last time. I don't understand it, Dad said to me later. Some people are afraid of a dying man. Others were wonderful. One office worker, Irene, had a warm understanding of what was happening from early on. She had joked and commiserated with my father over the months of his physical decline. Now I watched as she hugged him goodbye, and they laughed again. There were co-workers who had helped him overcome ALS disabilities so he could work those last few months. They had supported him in the great struggle I had missed, the struggle to continue his normal work life. They said warm goodbyes, a joke here and there, a touch on the shoulder, and shared a few tears. I felt thankful for their decency and friendships. With some, he spoke about his ongoing work. He had projects to continue and ideas to pass on. It was difficult for him to leave his work behind. My body is shot to hell, he told them, but my mind is as good as ever. As we traveled through the building, I said I could see he was proud that I was with him. He was not alone as he said his goodbyes. I was proud to be there for the final day of his public life. I was an assurance that Dad's life would continue at home, that he would be cared for by a loving family, and that there would be continuity through his son. Watching Dad with his colleagues, seeing his devotion to those people and projects, and seeing their respect and affection for him had me thinking about my own work. I worked alone, without colleagues or common purposes, or an institution that commanded my loyalty, and without much reward either. I was barely able to support myself, let alone a family. I believed in my work, those books I was writing about chicken ranchers, but I was isolated and poor. Here was my father on his final workday, showing me another way as he was retiring and dying. Wow. I guess I don't like that story. I'm going to read one more passage from this chapter. We concluded the visit with an inspection of a new building they had just erected on the site. Dad had helped design the electroplating machines inside. We went with Steve John, the plant superintendent, and one of Dad's oldest work friends. I had known Steve 15 years earlier, the big boss when I worked at the Southside Chicago plant. He ran those factories with authority and a friendly word for everyone. I admired him. Steve and my father gave me a tour with Dad riding in the wheelchair beside Steve. They explained the building electroplating machines inside and the installation of below-ground, huge state-of-the-art equipment for pollution control. Then silence. It was a cavernous building filled with machinery, massive, hard, bright machinery. The building was empty of other people. It was as if we were in a science fiction movie. Earthlings on a strange planet inspecting immense, unfathomable technology left behind by an ancient alien civilization, dwarfed by the technology and world before us. Dad sat in his wheelchair, quietly inspecting the scene, engrossed, intent, drinking it in. The contrast was painfully evident. My father, with his atrophying body, surrounded by that perfect, pristine, unyielding machinery whose life was just beginning. Steve was quiet, pensive, grim. I felt tears trickling down my cheeks. And I was tempted to end the chapter with that, but I found a more appropriate story to end it with. So I'll leave it to you to read that and decide to. And but it was that was a tempter to end it there, but it not right. I thought something a little more upbeat was needed, and I found it. So that's what I have to say about the book, and that's a couple of passages that I like. Questions? Thank you. Or comments?
I have a question.
Yes.
As I was driving over here tonight, and thank you, Ken, for being here, and thank you for the book, and thank you for reading those passages.
Thank you.
Really appreciate that. But as I was driving over here tonight, I wanted to know, and I'm sure that the experience with your dad went through different stages and phases from the illness until his death. And you can pick the stage you would like to answer my question. It's a two-part question. What would you have wanted to have heard from other people? What would have been helpful? What did you want to hear? And the second part is, what did you not want to hear?
Wow. What I wanted to hear about the ALS. Nothing really. I read a lot about it, and my mother decided she wasn't going to learn about it except as it came, and she had to learn about it. So she decided to remain ignorant. I read a lot. I don't think either of us was in a particularly better position than the other, because we knew from early on, at least I knew from early on, that this was going to be fatal. It's not fatal for everybody, but for most people it is pretty quickly, 2 to 5 years. And I could see by how it was taking, how his was developing, I could see it was going to be fast. I had seen statistics that for somebody his age to get ALS, 2 years would be a good outcome, and that's where I thought he was. So no, there was nothing for anybody to tell me about ALS. I guess there's some stories we tell in here. I tell in here about problems that we had along the way. He had a terrible swallowing problem because his throat muscles, his tongue muscles, all the muscles around swallowing stopped working, and he couldn't really get help from those muscles swallowing. And it happened to us. We had a particularly horrific introduction to it with a meal one day, and they didn't know what was happening. I turned to my ALS literature to figure it out. I could see that it was a common problem. There were solutions out there, not to end it, but just to help manage it. And no doctor had told us about this. It just came as a complete surprise. And we felt that way with a lot of ALS. It was just coming out of nowhere and stopping his body working and causing some tremendous problem. This was one of the worst cases. And I've described that meal in more detail maybe than I should have. So more information, I don't think that would have helped me. Less information? Well, my mother did pretty well with less information. That was a pretty good choice. I just couldn't do it that way. But no matter how much information you had, it was not going to help much with the ALS. And frankly, we're now 45 years later, and I do follow the ALS literature, and I don't see that things are much better myself. There's a lot of testing that's being done for drugs that will help. There's a lot of new management techniques that are helpful, but the basics of ALS are about the same as far as I can tell. I don't mean to be gloomy about that, but I don't see the improvement. So more information would not have helped. And what was the second part? Less?
What would you have liked to have heard, and what did you not want to hear?
What did I not want to hear? You know, my doctor friend, who I'm crazy about, who I called right after the diagnosis, when she described it as a dread disease, that word dread scared me. That's the name of my prologue here. Dread. It scared me. It's a scary word, and rightly so, because it's a dreadful disease. And dread is the proper awe, caution. So I could have lived without that word. But she gave it to me, and stuck with me, and I've used it. And so, you know, if you're a writer, you use everything you can, even what scares you. Other questions or comments? Yes.
Well, it's only finished, we're both nurses, so we were just discovering that. But so I'm interested in the relationship side than the medical. Your choice to do this with him, and what you talked about how you had a difficult relationship, and obviously we have to read the book to
Yeah.
get this in depth. But I'm just wondering, as you reflect on it now, what how your relationship evolved, your understanding of him and his understanding of you, and also I'm sort of interested in how you communicated with him during the process, obviously when he was less able to communicate in the usual.
Yes. So just on that last point first, one of the things that can happen and often does happen in ALS is people, their power to use their voice is diminished, and eventually it's not unusual for people to lose their voice, and that was something one of the things I was absolutely terrified about, that he was going to lose his voice and we couldn't communicate with him. He was very hard to help. He was a very difficult person in many ways, and with ALS he was just hell on wheels. And if we couldn't have understood what he was saying and what he wanted, we couldn't have helped him. And so that was a big fear that I had, and it never quite happened. He died before he lost his voice completely, and we heard him. So what, I don't know why things went south with us. I mean, as I've looked at it, I've thought he was a very controlling person, and I was a kid, and I wanted him to make room for me growing up and make room for me as a dad type person. And I remember once cleaning up his workshop down in our basement that he had built, and I spent an afternoon cleaning it up, and he came home and started yelling that he couldn't find his projects, and I never went into that workshop again. And that's still a painful story for me. And so that's kind of the tenor of it. We didn't have big fights, but he seemed disappointed or dissatisfied with what I did, and I couldn't stand up to him, at least not well. I eventually went to California. I mean, that helped me get out to Berkeley in the late 60s. So we had many disputes along the lines of that workshop that I tried to clean up, but stopped trying to do that kind of thing. We worked on all kinds of house projects together. He never showed me how to work with tools. I still can't do. I'd rather manage a project than actually get the tool. I can manage anything, but to get the tool and do the work, no. That's that. And so that was what we had, what the situation we had when he got ALS. That was the beginning point for us. And what happened with ALS was that he let me help him. And maybe he had to have the help, or he wanted to have the help. I thought it was a mixture of both. And I had the gumption to help. And he needed a lot of help with a lot of things, and I did that. And that was a huge growing up experience for me. And it also helped us step across that huge chasm that it created over the years. We never had a conversation about it at all. We never discussed having been on the outs. We never discussed making up. We never discussed, none of it. No heart to heart, nothing like that. But everything happened I felt everything happened that had to happen. He needed the help. I gave him the help. He appreciated the help. He applauded me for the help. And I think he felt some comfort that I would be there to help with our family after he was gone. He knew he was going, and it was important to him to know that everybody would be as okay as could be. And I think he had confidence in me by the end. So that was huge. And it was interesting how there never had to be that discussion, which I had imagined in my mind many times, that frank discussion that clears everything up. There was nothing that simple, and yet it was kind of simple. Just do what you had to do. And so that's the best I can answer that. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, yes.
I came very late. I'm sorry I talked about this, but do you have any insight into the causes of this condition?
Yeah, well, I've thought there are various theories about the causes of ALS, none of which I think tell us this is the cause. But one thing that has been speculated on in the literature a lot are proximity to heavy chemicals. He was a chemist, and there were things like mercury, probably, and others that he had worked with over the years, and it's possible that that caused something. You see that in the literature. You also see cigarette smoking in the literature, although I don't think as prominently as you'd find it for cancer or heart disease or something like that. But it's there, and he smoked, and we have a lot of pictures of him in our family, and he's got a cigarette between his fingers in almost every goddamn picture. It's really, you don't expect to see pictures like that anymore because we've changed so much in our society, but he was smoking. And the first time I went to the factory with him after his diagnosis, before this retirement, this was in December of 1979, he was smoking, and he wasn't supposed to smoke at home, and my mother thought he had stopped smoking, but he was smoking at work, and he was showing, so that's another possibility. Those are the two that come to mind to me, but especially the proximity to the chemicals. I think that's where I would look if I had the ability to do that.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Danny.
Since I knew your brother, both your brothers, how did you guys manage together? Was it stressful with your brothers? Did you do it alone, or was your brothers there to? Maybe that's too personal.
No, that's okay. I mean, it's all up on the table in the book, I guess. Although I didn't discuss my brothers because my middle brother, Mark, who was 2 years younger than me, has died from multiple myeloma. My youngest brother, Bob, is 8 years younger than me. He's still around. He's very much in this story. I haven't tried to define his experience because he's got his own views of things and helped me enormously with the book, but I didn't want to speak for him in the book. So there's no trying to attribute any of this to Rob or talk about what we agreed about and what we didn't agree about.
Right.
But he was there.
Right.
And
Everybody has a different.
yeah, and I didn't want to, it just wasn't my job. I could tell my story. I felt I could tell my parents' story. They're gone, and I could tell that story. But not my brother Bob, who's alive and well and has got his own views and is quite articulate. He can tell his own story if he wants to. But we worked together pretty well with my father's illness and took turns coming in to visit my parents. There was almost always one of us there or planning to be there pretty soon, and that made a huge difference for my mother. And we cooperated pretty well. You live through something like this, all the strains and stresses in a family are going to come out. At least that's my observation. And so they came out. We all had our moments with each other. My mother, my father, it was not smooth sailing. That's not how I would describe it at all. But we got by reasonably well. And my brothers did their share, and I was enormously grateful for it. I felt like I was the oldest, and I was ready to step up, and I felt like I did, and that was important for me. So, yeah, that's, I think, the best I can do on that. Other questions or comments? Comments?
I was just thinking that you and Rob did very different things. You took on different
Yes,
roles.
that's
you
right.
You all visited, but you had different strengths and you brought them to the table. And he lived closer, so he was.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the complementarity of how you
Yes.
work together. It's not that you we're not all the same.
Yes, my brother Bob, who's 8 years younger than me, he has a PhD in education, but he became a very gifted performer, children's performer, and he did very well with it, and he had a huge amount of imagination and skill, and he applied it to helping my father. So I dealt with all the financial and insurance and I don't know, medical, but he dealt with keeping my father entertained, which was no small thing. And he got books for my father to read or to be read to him. He got music for my father to listen to. He got a all-weather radio for my father to listen to, because my father liked to listen to the weather every morning. I never could figure out why, because he didn't go anywhere with ALS. He didn't go outside at all, but he liked to hear that weather. I speculated on this in the book, and I speculated that he liked it because everybody was powerless before the weather. It wasn't just him. And so he liked it, that nobody could control the weather, including him. But in any case, he loved the weather, and Rob got him a weather radio, and Rob got him books that we all read to him. There's a book called The Pushcart Wars, a kid's book, delightful book, and we used to read that book to my father. He got great arias, recordings of great arias. My father listened to opera a lot and had been a volunteer and a stage hand in operas, and he liked having those arias, and he liked listening to them. And there was a time period in his life at the end where he would just listen to arias every day and mourn for his coming death. And so Rob tapped onto a lot of things that were happening with my father that I didn't. I just couldn't. There was only so much I could absorb, and I had more, everything I could do. So that was fortunate. We kind of divided up the territory. Yes.
Was your grandfather alive during your lifetime, and what was your father's relationship with him?
My father's father, my grandfather, was a immigrant from Ukraine, from around Kiev, and came not long after 1905, which was a year of war, the Russo-Japanese War, which was a very good one to stay out of if you were on the Russian side, because they got whooped by the Japanese. He was a draft dodger, and I took a lot of pride in that. And he ended up in Chicago, and he started as a clothing cutter, but was pretty enterprising. And they had little neighborhood stores, and they'd rent a couple of rooms in the back where they'd live. And they'd open these stores at 6 a.m. and they'd be open till 12 midnight. And they sold food, but all kinds of other stuff too. If it was July 4th, there was fireworks, and if it was Christmas, there'd be Christmas gifts, and if it was time for school to open, they'd have school supplies and all kinds of stuff. And so they ran those little neighborhood stores and did well enough to survive on. It took my mother, my grandmother, my grandfather, my father, and his sister, the four of them, kept those stores going on the west side of Chicago. So I didn't know my grandfather well, but Yiddish was his main tongue, and he read in Yiddish. I remember him in a big overstuffed chair reading the Yiddish newspaper Forward, and he spoke a number of languages besides broken English, Yiddish, Russian, Ukrainian. That's 4, and maybe more, I don't know. And he seemed to be a very gentle man, and I didn't know him well. He was the first person that I was close to who died, and I remember his funeral. but I didn't know him well. And my grandmother, his wife, lived on into her 90s, and that's another complicated story that I tell in the book too. She was a difficult person for the family, and that problem migrated into the ALS stuff because my father had ALS and could see he was going to die before her. She was senile. She was in a nursing home, but she was not dead, and so he hadn't buried her, and that really bothered him. And so that was something my mother and I had to figure out a solution to, which my mother and I did, but that was painful. You know, I observed that before you go into the grave, you like to take care of your business, your life, and taking care of his mother in his lifetime was important, and he could see he wasn't going to make it. So.
I do have another question.
Yes.
if I may. I'm curious whether your dad's Judaism, his practice, his beliefs were of any comfort for him, any resource for him, and whether that was something that you could draw on, if that was, I'm just wondering about that.
Yeah. Well, he was not a learned man. He's not well educated in the humanities. He was a good chemist, I think. So he didn't know a lot about Judaism, but we were members of the congregation. There was a rabbi. I used to joke about his main participation as a Jew was the bowling league of the congregation, which he liked, and you know, that's where it was for a lot of those guys. And he read about Jewish history, and he was interested. And the rabbi for our congregation, came by once when he knew that my father was sick. He had heard, and he came by to comfort him. He was no comfort at all. He just didn't. He wasn't good at that kind of thing. And I was disappointed because I thought the rabbi would be my father needed somebody to talk to who he could confide in. I mean, I think I don't know what it's like to have ALS, but I thought that it's a hard way to live and die, and it would be helpful, I thought, to have somebody to talk to. And I thought the kids weren't the right person. My mother wasn't the right person. His closest friends, guys that he grew up with from the West Side, they didn't want to have anything to do with ALS. I mean, they were good guys, but no ALS. So they weren't around. And but the rabbi was, and he was no help. He came that one time. He came back 4 months later, and my father yelled at him, said, "I thought you'd gone to Europe to live somewhere else." He was really, really angry at him. It's really unusual to be that angry at a rabbi. You know, a rabbi is a learned person.
Rabbi Stern.
Yes.
Was it that rabbi? Yeah.
That's right.
We had the same experience. He was the worst rabbi in my mind.
So just one thing about Rabbi Stern. I actually met somebody who knew him well, somebody who was religious and became a rabbi himself, and said that everybody understood that he wasn't good at his pastoral duties. He was a learned man who studied, who was honorable. There's another story there about Rabbi Stern that I didn't make right. He doesn't come off well in here, and I feel a little bad about it. I feel like I let one. You know, there's a story there, and I missed it, and so Rabbi Stern in my history didn't come out well. And my father didn't have that person to speak to either about himself or about Judaism. And he and I talked about it a good bit. You know, I was doing this history of the Jewish chicken ranching community in Petaluma. So I knew quite a bit about Jewish history, American Jewish history. And so I talked with him about it. But I wasn't what he needed in that regard. And it didn't help him as much as it might have. the right person to talk to and read with would have been a godsend. But we didn't have that. Rabbi Stern was not that rabbi. So, any more, or should we
Buy your book.
call it a night?
Buy your book, have some wine.
Yes. There is wine and some snacks in there, I think, and please help yourself. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Very interesting for me.
Just brought some memories back from
Yes.
diagnosed with ALS.
Yes. Right.
And my parents moved back to Florida
Yes.
for the last 6 months.
They moved back from Florida to, yeah. Yeah.
And I visited